IVM.
If Swaraj is your birthright, do you have it?
What does Swaraj even mean? Do we have different concepts of self-rule?
And how does all of this play out in India today?
All this and more in this episode of the Pragati Podcast.
Welcome to the Pragati Podcast. We are your hosts, Hamsini, Hariharan,
and Pavan, Srinath. Every week, we get together to discuss public policy, economics, and international affairs.
Last week was India's Independence Day, and we celebrated it on the show by asking two guests, Nitin Pai and Aakash Singh Rathore, some questions on the state of the Indian nation.
This week, we are releasing a longer podcast, which we had recorded with Aakash. Aakash Singh Rathore is the director of the International Research Network for Religion and Democracy, and he was formerly the visiting professor at the Center for Philosophy at Jawaharlal Nehru University.
Not only is he an Iron Man, he is also releasing 4 books on topics like Indian political theory, Indian jurisprudence, and feminism later this year.
We'll be back with Aakash to talk about Swaraj and what Thin Svaraj is after a short break.
So it's going to be a great week on IVM this week. We have a brand new podcast launching, Wordy Woodpecker with Rachel Lopez. Every Tuesday, Rachel is going to break down fascinating words and why they mean what they mean. The show releases on the 21st of August. Be sure to check it out. And we have another new show launching as well, Know Your Kanun, hosted by lawyer Ambar Rana, where he addresses all law-related questions and gives us insights into the legal system of India. On Cyrus Says this week, Cyrus chats with actor Kubra Seth about the experience of making sacred games, life post the show, and her body of work. On Collabra Cartel, we have Jeremy Buck and Sandeep Hathiramani, the experts behind the bar at Miss T. They talk about the innovative cocktails they put on that menu. On the Vishal Gondal Show, Vishal speaks to Milind Devra about his interest in music, his vision for the country, and a hell of a lot more. Coach Urmi talks to actor and model Sarah Jane Dias about her fitness inspiration on the Kinetic Living podcast this week. And don't miss out on the final episode of Marbles Lost and Found for this first season, Therapy 101, hosted by Zan and Avanti. Also, guys, we're looking for a new producer, a social media intern, and a graphic designer. If you are interested in working with IVM and it's a cool bunch of people to work with, please send us an email to jobs@indusbox.com. Also, please make sure you're following us on social media if you're not. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Aakash, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
What does nationalism mean to you?
Well, it means something to me and it means something for me because I'm both a person who belongs to the nation, but I'm also a scholar who works on the topic of nationalism. So it's always easier for a scholar to distance himself a little bit from it and talk about what it means for me. But hopefully I'll develop the courage also to say what it means to me. So there's a long-standing and very important history of philosophical and political thought about nationalism. Do we even need it? And in India, it goes back even to the conversations of various freedom fighters themselves. Tagore and Gandhi had a very significant debate on this issue where Tagore's position was, I'm not even sure that we're going in the right direction on this, which of course he later represented in various stories that have been brilliantly filmed by Satyajit.
He even wrote a book, right, on nationalism?
Yeah. 3 lectures on nationalism, which he delivered in Japan and India as well. But the thing that I think captures it most, which maybe gets to the question of what it means to me, is in Ghare Baire, translated as At Home in the World. So what this novel does, it starts to understand the relationship that an individual has in participating in a national movement. What does it mean? Is there a conflict between what your values are, what you're attempting to achieve through a nationalist movement, and who you really are? So do we alter ourselves to conform to a conception of the nation? And Tagore was extremely concerned that yes, indeed we do, and violence is the inevitable result, kind of authoritarian ideology and so on. So that, in a way, reflects also my own concerns. Nationalism means, to me, as a scholar, a significant area of political and philosophical importance. But as a citizen or as a person, we see this playing out in all sorts of ways. So I've been teaching at JNU the anti-national university of India, right? This is declared like this. My experience with the majority of the students at JNU is that they regard themselves, they won't use the word nationalist because that has a certain color, but they regard themselves as out and out patriots. So it becomes very personal, very interesting. Sometimes I'll hear myself speak and I'll think, maybe I am an anti-national, if this is the position that I hold. So it becomes a question of self-understanding. How do you fit in? Where do you fit in? And why do you fit in? It is a very rich topic.
So would you consider yourself a nationalist?
Yeah, I very strongly consider myself a nationalist. The question is, would you consider me a nationalist?
Could you also tell us a little bit about this idea of Thin Svaraj that you've written about?
So Thin Svaraj is a concept that I put forward precisely because of the experiences of the divisive nature of nationalism. So on the one hand, we find ourselves, each of us who thinks on these topics, and I'm sure every ordinary citizen who's not even thinking on it, but just living their lives, finds ourselves stuck between these rival conceptions. So on the one hand, to be a nationalist means X, Y, and Z. And if you're not subscribing to X, Y, and Z, you're an anti-national or not adequately patriotic or something of this sort. And yet, if X, Y, and Z includes a strong smell or taint of saffronization, then the last thing I want to be is a nationalist. Let's say if I'm a liberal, a left thinker. Now, are these really the options that every Indian citizen should be faced with? That either you can proclaim yourself as a nationalist, which means a saffron sense of it, or because of the fear that to be a nationalist gives you this strong saffron sense. Therefore, the alternative is that I am not a nationalist. And I think these are false opposites. So what I've tried to do with this conception of Thin Svaraj is find a third alternative, one that takes certain essential and important community binding features of nationalism and drops from it the community divisive features in the way that nationalism usually emerges in our public experience. So the way that I try to do this is to reappropriate the idea of Swaraj from the origin of our national movement, so the 1870s, from Tilak's time to independence, take this concept, but thin it out of the biases, the sort of communal mentality that was slowly packed into it, and come up with a way of being able to be proud of being a nationalist and being firm enough in your position to be able to say that just because I am not anti-Muslim, I am still a nationalist. So to fight off some of these tendencies that get packed into what it means to be national, when the farther right articulation of being national dominates the discourse. So Thin Svaraj is an attempt to be proud of being a nationalist without suffering the debilitating features of violence and communalism and so on that are often necessarily built into what it means to be a nationalist today.
So in a sense, though it might be Thin Svaraj, it might be a richer Swaraj because you want to be more plural in the idea of what it means to be a nationalist, right? That there is no one person or entity which has a monopoly over defining what nationalism is, and who, more importantly, is a nationalist.
Right. What you say there about the thickening.
Or I said rich, but
rich. So let's just speak for 1 second on what does it mean thin. So this very concept, thick and thin, comes from anthropology. And the origin of this idea is that some things require more deeper commitment from the whole of the person, and some things require less commitment from the whole of the person. And this distinction becomes a thin act or a thick act. So if I'm going to, let's say, murder somebody, to take a extreme example, and I'll have to evaluate later why that came to mind. then this is going to take an intense, all of the films and the dramas and the tragedies are about that. How much goes into having to do something like that? So extreme existential issue. But if I'm going to lend you 10 rupees, how much of, maybe I'm a miser, or maybe just very thin amount of my personality gets materialized in that act. So the idea is how much commitment of my values, of my metaphysics, belief in life after death, of my theology, how much of those thicker aspects need to really be brought into the conception of the nation. What I want to do is that we get to show that we can have a wider community of nationalists if we thin out the metaphysical and the theological and the racial and the ethnic and the linguistic considerations that normally define the center of the nation. So this is why it's thin. It can be very wide, but it is still thin because the commitment is less.
Okay, I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, do you believe the personal is political? And the second is, what do you mean by Swaraj? Earlier when we were talking over here, you'd broken the word down for us.
Yeah.
So could you do that?
Yes. To talk about the word Swaraj without boring you endlessly is going to be difficult. I'll try to microscope it. But so let's talk about this expression in the American political system, because it's quite fascinating. The American political system, it required feminism to point out that the personal is political. And the conservative opposition to such an idea is that, no, the personal is not political. But let's see, what are we really talking about in this debate? Everything that the conservatives, who are pitted against the feminists in this discourse, are in favor of is a violation into the personal. So abortion, sexuality, everything that happens inside the family, even sodomy, homosexual, these are all personal issues that are legislated by the conservatives, who at the same time say the personal is not political. So the personal has always been political, but the awareness that we have around it and the significance that we give it is, of course, open to various contests.
So if the personal is political, then how can you thin it out from nationalism?
Yeah. So this is the last part of what I was mentioning. How much of it we bring into the political sphere is, of course, open to issue. So before I get into Swaraj, just a word on that. The self, if we speak about it anthropologically, is generally articulated. What does it mean to be a human being? You are necessarily racialized, let's say. But race is a social construct. You're necessarily gendered. Gender is largely a social construct. I'm not going to say completely like Judith Butler might say, but we have to say very largely, right? This is, speaking of considering myself a nationalist, one of the greatest feelings of national pride I have is every time I land in India from abroad. Why? Because you get a landing card that says male, female, and other. And it fills me with pride because I've been all over the world, and there are maybe 4 countries in the entire world that have made this recognition that India was a pioneer in making, is that gender is, ambiguous. So this is a moment of national pride that I feel when I land in India from another country, that we have got this figured out.
The same with the Aadhaar, by the way, for all of its flaws, for all of the problems. It was one of the first cases of a form that an Indian received where you could take male, female, or other.
Yeah. I won't go with you on the Aadhaar because I'm...
That's a whole different ballgame.
Yes. No, only in this context.
But does being gendered fit into the notion of Swaraj? Of course it does. If you're going to have Swaraj, it has to be for all genders. To have patriarchal Swaraj is just as bad as having a Brahminical Swaraj, which was Ambedkar's argument that, why should I have your kind of Swaraj when I will be a slave, even more so than I am under a British rule. So I don't think it's very debilitating, but it does require a nimbleness of thought. And more importantly, it requires a willingness to cooperate. This might be a little circular, because if we were willing to cooperate in the first place, maybe we wouldn't even have these problems.
So is it about building a sense of willingness to cooperate in spite of certain differences? To me, the extreme from what you said was something Pratap Bhanu Mehta refers to as the tyranny of the compulsory identity, right? So, yes, you subscribe to a certain gender, but that is not what you are at all times. You are not a woman in every conversation. Right. You're a person, you're a human being.
Yeah.
And that, especially in the way that states deal with citizens, when they apply that, okay, you are a Dalit and only a Dalit, and you are a, Brahmin and only a Brahmin, and that gets us into bad territory, right? So a nationalism which is perhaps agnostic to a few of these things, or accommodating, perhaps a combination of both, is perhaps closer to what you're speaking about?
Yeah, this is largely one aspect of the situation as I see it, which is that within various social structures, I occupy radically different places. Yesterday, I was at the Bangalore Central University, dressed as I dress, always, and I couldn't get in to see the Vice-Chancellor. And I said, just tell him that Aakash is here, and he will, the scum that I am, he will bring me into his august presence. They couldn't believe it. You're not going anywhere in that T-shirt. You're not going anywhere near him. So we have all of these hierarchies. But if you, in that context at Bangalore Central University, I'm a pauper, I'm a peasant, I'm a nobody. But then I'm standing in front of a classroom at JNU, and I'm the most privileged person. There are now, I'm sure, people outside preventing others from coming to me, right? So this is always happening. In one position, I'm oppressed. In another, I'm oppressor. In fact, this was in 1910 in Dr. Ambedkar's very first work for his master's degree at Columbia University. This was the point he drew up. How is it that we've retained this system of caste for so long? Because it's a system of graded inequalities where every one of the varnas has an interest in oppressing the other. So it's not just that some are oppressed by some. It is that everybody is oppressing everybody, which accounts for its longevity. And this is a fact. In some cases, I'm an oppressor. In some cases, I'm oppressed. And hopefully we maximize the places where we're equal, right? Where none of that is happening. The recognition of that variability of our position is also a recognition of the vulnerability of our position, which we can universalize in our imagination. If I have that experience, I know that you have to have that experience. And you have that experience, and you have that experience. How do you have it? You might have it because of gender. I might have it for some other reason. But we analogize these experiences, and only then can we transcend the thickness of our identity in order to come up with a thinner sense of political community.
All right. So Swaraj in one line.
Now, Swaraj in one line. You've just heard that I'm not good at one line. 2 lines. I'll do it in 3 if that's...
All right.
Yes. This is a compound word of the Swa and the Raj. And in all of the Indo-European languages there are cognates with Sanskrit. In Latin, Swa is sui, and Raj is rex. We get like Oedipus Rex or the king. So Swa is self in English, and it's auto in Greek. Okay, like a automobile, something that moves by itself.
Autonomous.
Autonomy, something that gives itself the law. So the Swa is the auto or the self, and the Raj is the Rex, the rule, the sovereign aspect. So you can translate it as self-sovereignty, self-rule. I translate it, because of how I've just articulated it, as authentic autonomy. Now, where do you get that? Autonomy is clear because they're perfect cognates, autonomos and Swaraj. Why is this autonomy authentic? Because autonomy has a very liberal connotation, right? I will do what I want. whereas authenticity has a very communal orientation. In fact, autonomy is a catchword of liberal thinking, and authenticity is a catchword of conservative thinking. So I use the translation authentic autonomy to capture the essence of Swaraj, because the essence of Swaraj is complex and manifold. It has great liberal ideas of my individual worth and self-determination, that I will not do what others tell me to do. But it has community ideas, which are that the very motivation I have, the things that are most personal and private in me, are a gift of the community. I'll give you an example, because people often have trouble stomaching that. Now, you're thinking something right now, and you're thinking something right now. I have no access to what you're thinking. Sure, there are certain signs. But our most intimate, the very most intimate thing that we have that nobody else can know, is our internal dialogue. What we're saying to ourselves. Yeah. No one else has access to that. What language is it?
For me, English.
You didn't create the language, whatever language it is. There is no internal monologue, which is what makes you most individual, inaccessible to the others. That can occur except in a language given to you by your community.
All right, yeah.
So the constitution of the self in my individual autonomy, and how do you exert yourself? I will not do it. Whatever language you want to say it, okay? This I, this subjectivity, this self, this liberation and owning of yourself is only made possible because the community has given you the language according to which you have your internal dialogue and make your autonomous decisions. This is why Swaraj, the rule of the self, the control of the self, is in fact a mediation between the community and the self. That's why I call it authentic autonomy. That was like 40 lines. I'm sorry.
That's great. But now we get a good sense of what Thin Svaraj is and how it's something that many people can start subscribing to. I think at Takshashila, we have tried to formulate that as liberal nationalism.
Right.
But I think by and large, we're saying the same things.
Yes.
And what struck me a lot with the Indian national movement, with whatever religious, racial, class, caste overtones that there was still this aspiration, I think, like with people like Gokhale, for example, that for them, the nation was the universal set almost.
Yeah.
So it was a very humanist movement. So it was more very inclusionary rather than exclusionary.
Right.
It was not about saying who is not an Indian.
Yeah.
It was about saying we are all Indians, so let's do something good together.
That's right. Yeah.
So I think that captures this well. So you have to thin out all the differences that are there between the people, not necessarily obsess over it, but figure out how to come together.
Yes.
And work together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. I have a small concern about liberal nationalism. On the whole, I subscribe to it. There's one aspect of it which is somewhat methodological, which preoccupies me in my own work. So all the books that I write, I always spend a lot of time on methodology. And this is because that I recognize that I'm an elite. You know, when it comes to educational background, cultural background, all of these things, I'm an elite. So I have to challenge myself. And if I don't challenge myself, anyway, someone else is going to challenge me. So it's not avoidable. What right do you have to be laying out the terms of nationalism or laying out the terms of what it means to be Indian or anything like that? What right do you have? And the fact is, I have very little right, but I have some right. You know, I don't have all right, but I have some right. So how do we get the right? It's an aggregation of everybody's input. And there have been historically and traditionally excluded people from the input into what it means to be India. So my primary methodological concern is that when we draft the content to fit into the concept of nation, when we draft that content, it should not continue to be, as it often and always has been, predominantly of certain dominant castes and of one gender and of certain classes. So the real question for me is methodologically how to widen the social base of those who articulate what it means to be part of the nation. So it's not merely a very Tagorean-like enlightened conception, because Tagore was an enlightened, brilliant man. And how many of us can really think on that capacity?
Right.
So when he tells us this is the way it is, well, I'm very glad he said it, but none of us feel it, right? None of us can do it. So we need to go down, not have this elite declaration and, from hyper-educated people. We need to go down and find out what makes us Indian and ask people. Ashish Nandi's work is very interesting in this regard because he tries to find out in grassroots studies what are people's conceptions about violence and community and what makes you Hindu and what makes you Muslim and so on. And this paints a very different perspective from the scholarship that comes out on secularism and religious studies and religious violence. Just the same, any concept of nationalism that's put forward can be conceptually clear because it's articulated within a system of academic discourse, but the content of it has to pass muster with the people, right? With the people. It has to be legitimized. Legitimacy comes from the bottom. So in liberal nationalism, my one concern is that we take the principles from the freedom movement, which was largely an elite movement. All freedom movements are elite movements. Now, 70 years later, and it's been a long time, let's start to democratize our freedom movement, which means that go down to the base of legitimacy and really start to work with people to understand what do they mean by the nation, what is inclusion for them, what is exclusion, what are the practices that they consider to be just and unjust, and so on.
This actually brings me to the next question. I was going to ask you, it's been over 100 years since we've been talking about Swaraj. It's been over 70 years that we've gotten independence. How far have we come?
Yes. I think we've come very far. This is a little complicated because when people like Ambedkar was one of the greatest champions for universal suffrage. When he begins discussing universal suffrage was not a new thing for India. It was a new thing for the world, right? There were very few countries that conceived of this. So India positioned itself when they accepted Ambedkar's idea of universal suffrage for the eventual, what they called Swaraj constitution. India positioned itself as a thought leader among all nations, not just as a decolonizing, colony that is trying to eke out its freedom, but as a thought leader for all nations. Part of why Gandhi rejected the permanent seat at the UN. In the UN, because we're setting new paradigms for the world, not these old ones. If you gauge from that metric, we haven't come very far. Okay? This is a conundrum. If you gauge from that metric. But if you gauge from actual delivery of services to masses of people who were excluded, not just in post-independence India, but always excluded, then we've come very, very far away. So someone like me who has an ambiguous relationship with the administrative state, something I find very frustrating, and bureaucratization, debilitating bureaucratization, and so on. From my advantage point of view, I would really like to get rid of the state, for all of its interference. But then think about the people who finally have water after centuries, who finally have, consistent sustenance, who finally have education, who finally have literacy. None of that would have been possible without our elephantine state, which creates such a headache for people like me. So there are different ways to look at it. In some ways, in terms of what our thought leaders propounded, we have come nowhere near our own predictions of what Swaraj means in 1920. In some ways, for the reality on the ground, for people who have been excluded from any government, British, whether imperial, colonial, feudal, from them we've come light years forward. For them we've come light years forward. So it's a bit mixed, I think, but one should always watch one's class position and caste position and so on when pontificating on how far we've come, because each of us have come a different distance, and some of us, thanks to the state, have come very light years ahead.
All right. So the last question is this: what gives you hope? What gives you despair about the state of India?
Yes. Despair, I think, is the easy one. Where do we not see it? I'm involved in higher education reform. This is a mixed issue. It gives both hope and despair. We have one of the least general enrollment populations in higher education in the world. And we're also youngest country in the world. You put those two things together, that's despair. But there's a great deal of hope because it's a fix that is not impossible. Well, I'm not sure how we're going to solve our communal problems, but this is just an institutional and administrative one. So this is a sort of area where hope and despair are mixed. In terms of communal violence, despair dominates because one doesn't know how on earth we're going to solve this when, without education on the one hand, we're informed of the nature of people and the nature of argumentation and so on through social media and screaming talking heads on television. So what I find is we have a largely uneducated population, including the elite, who learn terms of discourse and negotiation only through those media. So this is another very difficult issue. If we increase our general enrollment in education and we improve the standards of communication and civility in argumentation and debate, then we can mediate between a lot of the immediate movement to violence, to screaming, to shouting, to lack of empathy and so on that currently rules the day. So for what I hope is that we correct a few of the soluble issues and they will contribute to correcting some of the more right now seeming insoluble issues like our eruptions of violence and atrocities being committed on people all over the country.
Right. In that sense, there is some sort of a fungibility between social issues and economic issues, right? So if, say, India is creating enough jobs every year, enough employment, enough wages and living standards, I would think that not as many people will be obsessed about a religious or other difference, because here all these conflict games seem to be a zero sum, right? The pie is only so small. I want to slice it in a way that my half is not half but bigger. But when we are actually improving outcomes on education and employment and other things, there's more for everyone to go around. So I would think that even for a government, issues can be fungible. If, say, economics is not working, it makes sense to perhaps put the pedal down on social issues.
Right. No, that's a very good point, and all social history bears out your point. These are the places where we find the least eruptions of violence, are the places where we find the most involvement of people in civil society, in economic and
right. I mean, you needed hyperinflation and unemployment in the Weimar Republic for somebody like Hitler to seize power.
To emerge, This is captured in this concept of inclusive growth, because then you find both the social side and the economic side. What I'm worried about is that the technocratic and economic domination of our governance, on the one hand, seems very liberating. On the other hand, focuses exclusively on growth rather than on inclusive growth. So this is another thing that we'll see how it plays out. But I do think you're right that a lot of these problems the tensions can be reduced just by implementing wiser and sounder measures in other spheres of governance.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Wonderful.
That's it for this episode of the Pragati Podcast. Thank you for staying till the end.
If you have any questions or comments for Aakash or for either of us, you can always send them in to podcast@thinkpragati.com.
You can listen to the Pragati Podcast on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcast from. We're there everywhere.
Hello, I'm Chuck. I'm Shriketh.
And I'm Naren.
And together we are the hosts of the podcast
Simplified.
And we are going to be doing a 100th episode. Which is going to be a live episode at Dulali in Khar in Mumbai on the 25th of August 2018.
Yes, we should get the year right.
We're going to be doing a lot of fun things at the show. We are going to be talking about some stuff, simplifying them. We're going to have a very erudite guest who's going to hopefully make up for our silliness, but we sincerely doubt it.
And there's definitely going to be a lot of beer, so we really hope you join us.
It'll be fun, and it'll be more fun if you guys are there. So do land up.
See you. Bye-bye.
Why don't we talk about mental illness? For that matter, we don't even talk about emotional wellness. And if we can't talk about either of these basic, very basic aspects of being human, what do we do when we just feel like something's not right?
Hi, I'm Zain.
And I'm Avanti.
And this is Marbles Lost and Found, a show where we invite conversations about mental health and illness and just get people to talk about it, because it's okay to do so. Catch Marbles Lost and Found every Tuesday on the IVM app, website, or anywhere you get your podcasts from.